The Bible mentions a great war in heaven. My question to you is why would someone want to go to a place where there was a great war? Couldn't war happen in heaven again?
Yeah, it's interesting that you frame that question that way, because I might think, I can imagine that I might think, if I was in heaven, why would they let any of us in when we've already shown our true colors? But I think, to the point of your question, that's one of the reasons why God is dealing with the problem of evil the way that he is. Through, not by force, not by power. If that was the case, the conflict would be over immediately. But he's doing it through a demonstration of his righteousness and a demonstration of his love. And Paul talks about this very clearly in Romans 3 and Romans 5. And the way God does this, supremely through the cross and beyond, showing that God truly is love and God truly is good, actually defeats all of the allegations against God's character, the questions that were referred to earlier that were raised about his justice. All of these are answered in a way that will eventually satisfy everyone, so that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Christ is Lord, and everyone will recognize that God is righteous and just. And this demonstration through the plan of redemption, supremely through the cross, effectively inoculates the universe so that everyone sees just how evil sin is, and no one will ever want it to rise again, and it never will rise again. And we can be sure of that, at least to the extent that we have faith in the Bible, which I do, because the Bible promises that sin will never rise again. And God can know this with certainty because he knows the end from the beginning. So from a human vantage point, it looks like, oh, maybe this could be a repeating cycle. But God promises us in his infinite wisdom that it will not rise again, and he has done everything that is necessary to effectively inoculate the universe from this ever taking place again, so that this controversy will be ended once and for all, not through force, but ultimately through love and righteousness.
What you're presenting is really fascinating, because it seems like the dilemma of God is, how do you secure the universe from another rebellion, another planet Earth, another insurrection from happening without violating the choices of his creatures? And what you're describing right here is God's primary objective is to secure the universe and preserve freedom of choice in that very process. And he's able to accomplish that through the means of the cross. And any other alternative path that we would sometimes prefer God to utilize, like immediately end, would just recreate the same kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Same kind of dynamics that would bring about rebellion again.
Yeah, I think that's right. I often invite my students, when they say, why did God do this, or why doesn't God do that? I often invite them to ask, well, what other alternatives are available to God to accomplish that purpose? And if we think about it for a moment, we realize we don't know. Because we don't know all of the factors that God is dealing with. We don't know all the parameters involved. We only see a very small part of the picture. But I think we can look to the God of the cross and answer with conviction that if there had been any other way, that God who's willing to die for us, he would have chosen it. And just recognize we can trust him, and there's things beyond what we know, but we can trust his infinite wisdom and his infinite love.
One more question for you, and I'm not sure if you can answer it.
Probably not.
Is there a question God cannot answer?
I think there are questions God cannot answer, but they're of the kind that go against God's character. So there's no informational question he couldn't answer, but there are questions like, who do you not love? For whom would you not die? Right? God's love is so great that if there was just one sinner that Christ that had to go through the cross for, to die for, he would have gone through it for that person. So those kinds of questions, there's no answer to. But when it comes to informational, God knows everything, right? 1 John 3:20, God knows all things.
You know, it's really interesting when you're reading the book of Revelation, and you have this sort of end time scenario where the lost come before God, and there's this dialogue of some kind that happens. We don't know what the dialogue is precisely, but it comes to this place where, every knee shall bow. In other words, there's acknowledgement at the end of the day that God was just and true in his actions, right? Is there questions in our universe, it's not that God doesn't want to answer, it's because there is no answer to this question. Are there things like that?
There are things like that, and the number one question like that is the question of the origin of evil itself. Why would anyone ever rebel against a good and loving God? And that is referred to in theology as the mystery of iniquity. Because to do something evil, to introduce evil, is actually irrational. It is anti-love. One way of defining evil is that which is against love. And why would anybody do that? Particularly the angel who fell and became Satan. Why would anybody fall from perfection and do that? And we can talk about how it happened, turning inward, becoming selfish. But why someone would make that decision, to try to answer that would end up excusing it, when in fact there is no rational reason for that kind of decision. And that kind of question cannot be answered because it lies in the individual who makes that decision freely. But God's justice and his character and his righteousness, that he has done everything that could be done, every step of the way for the best good of all concerned, that can not only be answered, but it can be demonstrated. It was demonstrated first at the cross, supremely at the cross, and it will be demonstrated in the next life when we're able to see, when God shows us the end from the beginning, and we can see everything he has done, why he has done it, and that he always and only had everyone's best interest in mind.
Do you believe that we are alone in the universe? And if so, or if not, what do you think that says about God wanting to make life abundant, or about the uniqueness of the human consciousness?
I'm going to let him take that.
So I do not think we are alone. The Bible doesn't talk much about this issue, but it does make very clear that beyond our world there is not just God, but there are also the angels, and also fallen angels, and that there is more going on than meets the eye, both in our world and beyond our world. Additionally, there's some scenes throughout Scripture that some scholars refer to as heavenly council scenes. Like in the book of Job, you have this scene where Satan comes to where God is, and the sons of God are there to present themselves. And so, we don't really know exactly who those sons of God are, but some people think that they're representatives of other worlds in this kind of like heavenly courtroom scene. So the information we have is partial, which is often the case when it comes to big questions and things of God. But what we have suggests that there is life out there more than just God, other creatures. And I think it does point to the fact that God is love, that there's a universe beyond our imagining, that it also seems likely, I don't want to speculate, I'm not God, there are many things I don't know, but it seems likely that a God of love would create much more than what we see within the limits of our solar system or the furthest that our telescopes can reach.
What does that tell us even more about the plan of redemption? Does the fact that we live in a bigger universe in some way diminish the plan of redemption, or does it enhance the bigger picture and the moves that are made within the plan of redemption?
Yeah, I think it actually enhances it. So Paul writes about this, and he describes what he has gone through and the other apostles have gone through, and he says that we are like a spectacle or a theater to men and to angels, suggesting that there is an entire universe that is looking on more than just what is happening on this earth. And the plan of redemption, Paul also describes in cosmic terms, that all of creation groans. And I think that extends to the entirety of the universe that is affected by the questions that are raised on our planet with sin and evil, that God is working to answer through the plan of redemption. And so what Christ does to save us is not just to save me individually, although it is, not just to save this world, although it is, but is to actually redeem the cosmos and to inoculate the universe such that evil will never rise again.
Any other questions? Right over there. Inherent to suffering is the question to God, why?
Yes.
Why is this happening?
Yes.
And the very fact that Jesus himself entered into that very experience tells us how much he took on humanity.
Yes.
That he himself cried out, why?
Yes.
Why is this happening?
Yes.
Why does the human heart crave answers?
Yeah.
in the midst of suffering?
I think in the midst of suffering, everyone needs something to hold on to. We all want answers to life's ultimate questions. And it's not just the question of suffering. We have all these big questions that are very difficult to answer. What's the meaning of life? What is my purpose? But I think in the midst of suffering, when we're going through evil, that's when the rubber hits the road, maybe in the strongest way. Like, is everything meaningless? Does anything really matter? Is there really a God? And I think that we need to recognize at this juncture, when we're asking these questions, that, as you said, Jesus himself modeled this for us already as our example. And Jesus himself is the ultimate figure in a long lines of figures in the Bible of people who went through undeserved suffering. And one of the greatest examples is Job. He goes through all of this undeserved suffering, so much that he cries out to God and questions God and says, God, you've been cruel to me. I wish I was never born. And finally, at the end of the book, a number of events happen, but he has a conversation with God. And God doesn't scold him. God says that Job did not, he says of Job's friends, they spoke what was not right of me, because they all said, oh, this must be happening to you, Job, because you deserve it, because you've done something wrong. You've done something that God is judging you for. Job knew that wasn't the answer. He hadn't done anything to deserve this. And at the end, God says they had spoken what was not right of him, but of God. But he doesn't say the same thing of Job. But what he does say to Job is he says, who are you? Right? Were you there when I created the world? Who is this in Job 38? God says, who is this who darkens counsel with words without knowledge? And in one translation of that verse, it says, why do you talk so much when you know so little? And in that encounter, Job recognizes how little he knows. And he actually says, I spoke of things that I did not understand, things too wonderful for me. And so there's always a point where we have to recognize that God is bigger than our questions. And when we're suffering and asking the deepest questions, one thing we can hold on to is that when we suffer, God suffers with us, whenever anyone suffers. When my son, he was 5 at the time, he broke his arm, I would have rather broken my arm. And I think he recovered from that sooner than my wife and I did, not just physically, but emotionally. But it's even more so with God, because all of us are God's children, and he loves us more than we can possibly imagine. And whenever we suffer, he suffers with us. And when it seems like God is the farthest from us, he's actually the closest to us. And in the end, in the new earth, we will be able to see that, see the end from the beginning, and recognize God was with us, just as he was with Christ on the cross.
Now, what you're describing is it's very interesting, because a lot of the questions that you see in the Bible, I mean, there are people who are very inquisitive, and then there are people who are very skeptical, right? When do questions, according to you, when do questions no longer have any benefit to us?
Yeah. Probably most of us have heard the saying, there's no such thing as a bad question. And I think that saying is true if the question is asked in a spirit of actually seeking the answer. I think a question becomes a problem when it's used as a weapon. Okay? So God is always big enough to handle all of our questions. It'd be silly to say, I'm not going to raise my question with God that's in my mind. He already knows what's in your mind, right? He already knows if you're questioning. So there's no point in trying to withhold that from him, right? You can bring it to him. He's got big shoulders, so to speak. He can handle all of our questions. But to try to hide it from him is kind of like playing hide and seek with my son when he was young. And he'd hide behind a tree and be like, "Oh, Daddy, you can't see me, but I can see him," right? The tree's not covering up. Right. I know exactly where he is. God knows all of our questions already, and so we have nothing to fear from bringing our questions to God. He can handle our questions, whatever they may be.
And what you're pointing out is it's important to be in this evaluation of our own motives behind the questions. Are we genuinely interested in the answer?
Yes.
And when the answer comes, are we prepared to accept that answer, whatever it may be, right?
That's right. So you can wrestle with God, even as Jacob wrestled with God in Genesis. But the key is not to try to wrestle him away. So if your questions are like a weapon, and sometimes people do raise questions, it's like a defensive. They don't really want the answer, because even if you answer that question, there's another question, there's another question. And it's not bad that there's another question, but the questions are really to deflect. The questions are really to move away. They're really like to wrestle God away. But what Jacob did, when he's wrestling with God, is he refuses to let go. And I think that's the key when we're asking questions. They should be asked in the spirit of good faith, in the spirit of trying to seek the answer. And if we're trying to seek the answer, again, we are told that if you ask, it will be given to you. This is a promise from Christ. Maybe not now. That doesn't mean we'll understand everything right now. But enough will be given if we seek the one who has all the answers and recognize that we do not have all the answers. We could not possibly have all the answers, and we shouldn't expect it to be otherwise. That's part of God's answer to Job. Do you know all of these things? Of course I don't know all of these things, but God knows more than we could possibly ever imagine. And a good question is whatever question that is asked when we're actually seeking the answer, and God welcomes all of those questions.
Dr. Peckham, I got